That's a bit better. Oh, Yankee Apple. First one on there. The lighting's a bit weird today. It's the sun is just setting and it's shining in this window on my left. Dama River, hello. Miroslav, good evening. More people popping in, good. Almost ready to start. Another 3 minutes. Okay. Oh, more. Someone's typing a long question into the chat here. Uniso Manisakara is defined as contemplating objects through the lens of Dhamma with wisdom. So seeing the three characteristics primarily. Yeah, that list that you're referring to in Anguttara goes from Uniso Manisakara to Sati Sampajanya to Indriya Samvara, that is from right reflection to mindfulness to sense restraint. And I think it generally works that way, but your mileage may differ. Sometimes things unfold in a slightly different way for people.
It's 6 o'clock.
Regarding the last part of your question, when defilements arise in the mind and you try and wrestle with them, as you say, that is, you are using Yonaso Misakara if you do that in a contemplative way to try and see the negative consequences, see the negative attributes of the defilement. Okay, so let's get on to the topic at hand. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. So this is continuing our series on Abhidhamma, and this is going longer than I'd originally foreseen, but that's okay. It's better to deal with it a little bit more carefully and thoroughly. It's a big topic, and there's a lot of ground to cover. So today we're going to be dealing with the Rupa Kanda, the category of matter or physical form. And I think this is going to take at least 2 sessions. To go back to one of the initial principles of Abhidhamma, all of reality is divided into 4 principal categories that are irreducible. They're Paramatta Dhammas, that is, one cannot be explained in terms of the other. These are the ultimate categories. And those are matter, rupa, chitta, with consciousness, chittasika, mental processes or objects, and nibbana. So we've dealt with chitta and chittasika. The category of rupa or matter is the other big grouping. And there is a lot of complexity in the descriptions and analysis of this. It seems it was a very big topic of debate amongst Indian schools and philosophers, both inside and outside of Buddhism. Everybody had their own particular theory of what constituted matter. There were some Buddhist schools, like the Yogacara, which is a later development, that denied there is any such thing as matter. Only mind is real, according to this school. In Western philosophical terms, that would be called idealism. This wasn't the position of early Buddhist schools, and it hasn't been the position of Theravada. There is, according to the Theravada Abhidhamma, there is such a thing as physical matter. It's not just an imagining of the mind. There is an external universe. And we can see the other complication is when we see and when we look at the Abhidhamma descriptions of matter, we see a definite historical development from the sutta descriptions of reality through the canonical Abhidhamma into the commentaries and sub-commentaries, that the position was continually being refined. And this is, I think, indicative here, something that we've seen before, that Abhidhamma is or has been an evolving, living tradition. It isn't one fixed set of principles that laid down for all time. It's a continual development. And there are still people today, Buddhist scholars and writers dealing with questions of Abhidhamma. It's ongoing. In the suttas, there is very little about matter in the abstract. The principal purpose or theme of the suttas is soteriological or practical. It's all about becoming liberated from suffering. The Buddha said, I only teach suffering and the ending of suffering. So what leads to that goal is what is important and what is interesting. As the Buddha said in one of his suttas, you see the leaves in the forest. That could represent everything that Tathagata knows. But this handful of leaves in my hand, this is what I choose to teach because this is what is useful. So the Buddha seldom got into abstract metaphysical questions. As far as it goes in the suttas, we have several mentions of the four great elements, which we'll see in a bit. That is also a foundation in Abhidhamma. But mostly, what the reference is always to the personal liberation of the listener, and it's almost always referenced when the four great elements are spoken of. It's almost always reference to the body, and the external elements are not very much considered, if at all. So we have the earth is the hard parts of the body, like the bones and the sinews, and the water element is blood and bile and the liquid parts. Air is the air in the wind in the belly and the wind in the lungs and the wind coursing through the limbs. And fire is the heat of digestion and the heat of the body, the energy of the body. Now, when we get to the Abhidhamma, that's not considered precise enough or exhaustive enough. So in the Abhidhamma, there's a detailed analysis of matter that, again, in the earlier text, the canonical Abhidhamma, the emphasis is mostly on the body, the elements in the body, but it expands to include a theory of matter in general. Now, I posted a link in the chat and in the description to this video to a bare bones kind of list that may be helpful to glance at and summarize the 28 kinds of matter. And we'll go through this a bit. I'm going to leave for the next talk the atomic aspect of this, the rupa kalapas and the material clusters, because this is a later development. There is some hint of an atomic view in the earlier texts, but it's only really developed later. The first most important principle of the nature of matter are the four great elements, the Mahabhuta. And these are in English, they're earth, water, air, and fire. In Pali, Patawi, Apo, Vayo, Tejo. And the first thing to understand about the four great elements is that the names are not literally what they are. They're more in the nature of mnemonics. So a fire, like the fire in the fireplace, or water, like water in a lake, that's not what's meant by the elements here of fire and water. They're more to be considered as properties of matter. Earth, Patawi, earth element, is defined as impenetrability, or the taking up of space. So it has the attribute of hardness, and the degree of intensity of any of the elements determines the nature of the object. So softness is also a quality of earth element in another mode. So there's like a range between soft and hard. But the idea of taking up space is the primary quality of earth element. The water element, Apo, is fluidity, viscosity, and also cohesion, meaning it's the element that holds the other components together. And it has the manifestation or the attribute of taking shape. If you pour water into, as an analogy, if you pour water into a jug or other container, it assumes the shape of the container. Air, Yo, is motion. And in terms of the physiological attribute, the theory of the biology of the time was that motion of the limbs, like when you raise your arms or move your legs, it's a kind of pneumatic process. There's a air element, or sometimes is better translated as wind element, to emphasize that attribute of motion. The winds course through the limbs and cause them to move. I saw once, I remember reading a Burmese translation of a Burmese Dhamma talk, and the Sayadaw said that when people are slouching over in meditation, it's because of a lack of wind element. They need to kind of get the bicycle pump out and blow themselves up. So the idea of wind element is motion. And the final one is fire element, Tejo, which is heat, caloricity, energy. And these four attributes are present in every instance of matter. And when we get to the looking at it on the atomic level, the idea is that one Dhamma of matter contains all these attributes together. So they're not separated by space. They're all in the same point. There's an earth element, a fire element, a water element, air element at each point where there's an instance of matter, of a physical object. And the difference is not in number or quantity, but in intensity. That the four elements can vary in intensity. So we get in the macrocosmic world, in the real world that we experience, we have a vast range of different substances, obviously. Not just four, but uncountable numbers of different substances. And they all arise by different intensities, different combinations of intensities of the four great elements, the Mahabhuta. It's maybe irrelevant and maybe not, but modern physics also says there are four fundamental forces that make up everything in the universe: gravity, electromagnetism, and the two nuclear forces called weak and strong. I've not seen that these map over very well into the four elements of the Mahabhuta, so it may be just entirely a coincidence. But it is indicative of the way the ancient Indian mind worked, how penetrating it was to try and understand physical matter in terms of interplay of these of different forces. So these Mahabhuta, these four are considered the primary constituents, and everything else is classed as dependent matter. And there's a fairly developed, in the later texts, there's a fairly developed theory of different combinations making up the atoms, or the Rupa Kalapas. But here we're going to leave that aside for the moment and look at some of these other dependent categories. If you look at the chart that I made up, which is mostly derived from Bhikkhu Bodhi and also from Karunadasa, we have 28 kinds of matter. And these are, excuse me, these are divided into two broad categories. There are those forms of matter that are called Nibbana, which means real or conditioned, and Anibbana, which means nominal or conceptual. And the distinction is that the forms of real matter, Nibbana, actually have a existence called in the Pali, it's called a sabhava, an own existence. Now, this is kind of a problematic term. The earliest texts denied there was any such thing as a sabhava, because it was interpreted in terms of the essence and qualities that is something that was very fundamental in many non-Buddhist conceptions of matter. And it's also in the West, coming from Aristotle, it's also based on the idea of substance and qualities, that an object has an essence and then it has qualities. Now the Abhidhamma denies this because it wants to base itself on a fundamental principle that an individual instance of reality, a Dhamma, is irreducible. It's absolutely simple. It occurs for a single moment. So it's instantaneous. And it doesn't, while it exists, it doesn't change into something else, and it has no qualities adherent to it. It just is as it is. So the qualities are the sabhava. In the later Abhidhamma text, the term is, this principle is not denied, but there's some little change in terminology, that the sabhava is equated with the qualities. There is no distinction. So there isn't that, like the fire element is not hot. It is heat. It's not that there's this thing that is hot. There is heat. You know, the quality is the reality, and that's what's called the sabhava. So to say that something has a sabhava is to say that it is subject to the three characteristics of impermanence, imperfection, and emptiness. It's to say that it's conditioned, And in Abhidhamma terms, it means that it is actually real, whatever real means in a metaphysical sense. It's classified as something existent. It has an ontological status as being existent or real. So the Mahabhutas, the four great elements, they are definitely Nibbana. They're ultimately Paramatta Dhamma. They're ultimately real and irreducible. But there are several other categories of matter that are also classed as real or Nibbana, but dependent. They arise dependent on the great elements. And some of these have to do, and these are mostly, I should say here also, these are almost entirely reference to elements of matter in a living being. This isn't here we're getting with these dependent matters. We're not speaking about inanimate objects, but of conscious entities. So there's categories to do with the senses. There's the sensitive matter, pasada rupa, and there's five of them to deal with the five physical senses. And there's quite a bit of discussion in the Abhidhamma about the senses and how they work and significance of them. For the eye and ear and nose, and in some places even the tongue, is considered that there's a very small part of that organ that is actually sensitive, that is able to relay information to consciousness. So the eye is a fairly big, complex structure, but there's only a tiny portion embedded in the eye that's actually sensitive. The rest supports it and has a subsidiary role. And this is somewhat borne out by modern biology, in that we could say that the rods and cones in the retina are the only real sensitive parts of the eye. The rest is for focusing the light and so on. And the same with the ear, that there's a tiny portion deep inside the ear that actually hears. And some of the Abhidhamma texts apply this to the tongue as well, that there is a very small portion at the base of the tongue that's actually sensitive. But other texts take, I think, a more realistic view that taste is distributed over the entire tongue surface. Touch is the only one that's clearly distributed over the entire body. The entire physical body has this sensitive element of touch. Then there are the sense objects, which are those aspects of matter that are processed by the senses, and they're quite specific here. The eye is said to process only color and shape, and this is quite important for the theory of perception. The eye doesn't see a table or chair, a tree, a dog, whatever. It sees only color and shape. And later, this system was refined to say that seeing it recognizes shape is redundant. It only sees color. It sees patches of color, and shape is an inference, is a conclusion of the mind. It's mind processing. But it's perception, or sanya, that takes these color and shape and recognizes and actually simulates objects. And the ear only hears sound. The nose only knows odors. The tongue only knows tastes. And the body only knows touch of pressure, heat and cold, pain and pleasure. And if you refer to the list that I've put up here, in the terms of objects, I put rupa, tactile object, in italics because it's a kind of a special case. Rupa, that is something felt by the sense of touch, only experiences 3 elements of 4. It doesn't experience water element, apo, which is another indication that we're not talking about physical water here. We're talking about a quality. One example given is if you plunge your hand into a bowl of cold water, water is that common everyday substance that has a strong intensity of water element, apo, in it. But you don't actually feel the apo, the water element. You feel the coolness, that's fire element. You feel some resistance, very slight resistance and pressure from the water, that's earth element. And you feel the motion of the water, that's air element. But you cannot feel the actual water element. So these various forms of derived matter dealing with the senses. Then there are 2 faculties that are called the sexuality faculties. One is femininity and the other masculinity, itatata and prisatata. And these are said to be distributed over the entire body. They're not focused in any one part. So the entire organism, for those organisms that are gendered, that is most of the sense desire realm, most of the kama dhatu are gendered. We have these these 2 opposite modes that do not exist together in one organism, but are experienced separately, and they affect the appearance and the behavior and the motions of the being. Then there are 3 additional instances of derived matter that don't fit into any of the other categories. One is hadayawatu, it's the heart base. This was added later to the list. It only appears in the later commentaries that as a seat for the mind sense. Remember that in Buddhist descriptions of the senses, there are 6 senses. There are the 5 physical senses, and there's also the mind sense that knows mind objects. Each of the physical senses has this base that we've talked about, the sensitive matter that is the base of that sense organ, and where it touches the consciousness, where it feeds information to consciousness, or consciousness is aware of objects through that as a vehicle. So it was felt, I think it was felt by the later commentators that to complete the system, they needed to postulate a base for the mind element. whereas the earliest mention of it is left deliberately vague. I think it's in the Dhammasangani that says in terms of the eye consciousness arises in association with the sensitive matter in the eye, and so on through the list, and then the mind arises into whatever physical base there may be in that case. And the Hadaya Watu, the heart base, was associated with a sensitive element in the physical heart, in the actual beating organ, the heart. Now, I think in modern times, we would think mind mostly associated with brain, if we're going to make a physical association at all. But they didn't do that in ancient times. We can see from the Visuddhimagga that there was, at least for Buddhaghosa, I don't know if there was any more advanced physiology anywhere in India, but at least Buddhaghosa did not have any conception of what the brain was or what it was for. In the passage where he's describing the 32 parts of the body, he says that for each part, he gives some description of its shape, its location, and also its functioning. And he says the brain is a species of marrow that's found in the skull, and that when you have a cold or other sickness, it liquefies and drips out of your nose. So obviously he had no idea of the actual nature of the brain. There's also another passage where in a Vinaya text where some two parents, a mother and father, have a boy who's coming of age, and he's been spoiled all his life, and they kind of mollycoddle him, and they're looking for a soft life for him, and they end up settling on getting him ordained as a monk, which turns out to be a mistake. He finds it's not such a soft life. But they're going through, in the initial part of the story, they're going through different occupations and wondering, should we make him a farmer? No, if we make him a farmer, he'll have to work hard all day out in the field and get bitten by flies. That's no good. Go through different occupations like that. And at one point they ask, maybe we should make him an accountant. And the mother says, no, if he's an accountant, he'd have to think hard all day and his chest would hurt. Yeah. So this Hadaya Watu is a heart base for is an addition to complete the system of the sense organs and sense doors. Then there's a Jivatindriya, which is the life faculty, and there's two of these. There we mentioned when we were talking about the Chitasakas, the mind elements, that there's a mental life faculty. There's also this is now the physical life faculty, and this permeates the entire body of a living being, and keeps a continuation of life going in the body. And it said when an advanced meditator enters Nirodha Sampati, the cessation, the experience of cessation, which is like an arahant, submerging or penetrating his mind into nibbana, that all the life processes seem to cease, and you can't really accept that there's still some warmth in the body. You wouldn't know it from live or dead. But then he comes back. So externally, you can't tell the difference. But the difference is that the life faculty is not extinguished. The life faculty is what keeps the continuity there. And the last of these derived real matter is Cabelecaro, which is physical nutriment. there is a idea that in food there's an essence, and this is again like the sensitive matter in the eye and so on. In food, there's a component in all the different kinds of food. There's a component called oja, which is the nutritious essence. And in the cosmology, at the origin of this earth, when this world system came to be, the surface of the ocean was covered in oja, nutritive essence. And the deities tasted it, and then they fell to earth and became physical beings. So this nutritive essence is something that's found in food that sustains the body. And it's that attribute which sustains the physical form. Um, the other forms of nutriment are kama, consciousness, and what's the fourth? Intention. And the only purely physical one is this Cabelecaro. Physical body is also has a cause in kama. The particular expression of the body, whether you're a human being or an animal, or whether you're a male or a female, and so on, this is derived from kama. So these are the derived real matter. Then there's another category of matter that's called anipana, or nominal, in that they don't have any real self-existence. They're not ontological reals. They're conceptual. And the first of these is akasa dhatu, or space. And this was something that was the definition or understanding of space is something that was debated amongst the different schools in Buddhism. In Sarvastivada, space is considered unconditioned. It's considered a real and an unconditioned element. Theravada denied that, in large part because Theravada likes to keep unconditioned absolutely pure. It's only nibbana is the only unconditioned element. There's nothing else to be considered unconditioned. And also space is, in the Theravada view, is not actually anything real at all. It's just a concept that we impose when there's two objects separated. We say that the place in between them is space. So in the debate of whether space is conditioned or unconditioned, the Theravada actually distinguishes between the two kinds of space. Space that is created, like if you dig a hole to make a well, you've created a space in the earth. That's conditioned. That's obviously conditioned by you and your shovel. But the more fundamental kind of what we mean by space as a physical dimension of space is not real. It's only a conception of the mind, a way of organizing reality that has no fundamental reality itself. Then there's two factors that are called the intimations, kaya vinyati and vachi vinyati, that is bodily and verbal intimation. And this is an intermediate stage in any action between it. First arises in the mind, a purely mental event. Like if you decide that you're going to pick up your pencil, first it arises in the mind, the intention to pick up the pencil. Then in the end, there's the movement of the arm and the hand to the table to pick up the pencil. But in between, the transference of that is what this kaya vinyati is, the physical intimation. It's the first kind of tension in the body. And this is actually a word that's used, like the tension in the body that builds to movement. And it's considered to be a factor of air element. It's an increase in the intensity of air element because recall that air element is the factor of motion. And we'll get into this, I think, a bit more in a subsequent talk on the atomic theory, but in the developed later stages of Abhidhamma, they actually denied there is such a thing as motion, because dhammas only arise and cease in this one location. And what we perceive as motion is simply a sequence of dhammas arising in different locations. But in either case, it's the air element that is intensified by this intimation. And the verbal intimation is similar. It's the intention to begin to speak or articulate, and that begins also in the mind, and then it's articulated as speech. But here it's an intensification of earth element, and the idea is that the production of sounds is analogous to like the striking of a gong, that there's a physical vibration, which actually is physiologically what happens. The vocal cords vibrate. And this vibration is an intensification of the earth element. Then there's three factors that are called vikara, which is difficult to translate, but Karuna Dasa uses the translation special modes. And these are exactly parallel to Chitasakas that we've looked at before, that there's a lightness of matter, malleability of matter, wieldiness of matter, just as there's the same factors related to the mental factors and to the mind. And these are not independent, self-existent. They're anipana, so they're more like concepts or qualities. And they also only apply to living organisms. We're not talking about matter in the abstract here, but only in living beings. There's and they are qualities that in terms of living beings and the biology of living beings, they're the factors that relate to health or sickness. That when these factors are strong, the being is healthy. The body feels light. It's malleable, meaning it can easily move and do things, and it's wieldy, meaning it's workable, it's functional. And when these factors are weak, then you're suffering from some disease. Then the last category are called the Lakkhana Rupas, the characteristics of matter, and there are four: Upachaya, Santati, Jarata, and Anichata, which are translated here as integration, continuity, decay, and impermanence. The first two are both related to the factor of, or they're aspects of the factor of becoming or birth. And the first one, Upachaya, refers to in any developing system of an organism when it's coming into being in the first place. So in the case of a human being, it would be the unfolding of the embryo in its early stages. So there's a point before it has limbs, and then it grows limbs. That's this quality of upachaya, is creating the limbs. And then santati is the development or further growth of something that's already come into being. So when the limb first arises in an embryo, it's very crude and undeveloped, but then it gradually fleshes out and develops fingers and all the rest. That's the quality of becoming or growth, santati. Jarata, decay, is when the being starts to break down when they get old, and it's listed like wrinkling of the skin, brokenness of the teeth, grayness of the hair, and so on. When as a being gets old, it starts to decay, and there's like a changeover in the life from the period when it's mostly growing, coming into being, and then it switches to decaying and falling away from being. And the final one is impermanence, is the ending. In the case of a living being, of a human being, it's death. It's when the being falls away. And these are related to what are another Abhidhamma concept of there are three characteristics. There's two ways of listing three characteristics. There's three characteristics of which is most commonly spoken of are um, impermanence, not self, and suffering. But there's another list of three characteristics which is applies to momentary dhammas, which is uh, coming into being or genesis, sustaining, and extinguishing. So comes into being, it exists for a moment, then it dissolves. And this is applied on as qualities that affect the physical form. Which one of these is predominant? So we have these different kinds of matter, but it all the uh, important point is the central idea is that physical matter is based on the four great elements, and all the rest is derived from that, and it's either has some reality or it's purely conceptual mode. And the four great elements exist in every instance of matter, and they exist equally in terms of quantity in every instance of matter, and the variation is only by intensity. And although they're categorized as separate individual dhammas, they occupy the same space. They're not separable by location. And the combination of the and variation of the intensity of the elements is what creates the different physical forms we know of, and their extension and location in space creates larger structures by multiplication, like many dhammas, many atoms. So I think that's enough for today. And next week I'm going to go into um, the other aspect of the theory of matter, which is the atomic view, or the structure of the material clusters or kalapas, and how they make up physical form. But today we've dealt with the four great elements and the various categories of derived matter. So now I'll stop there with the formal comments, and I'll go on to the questions and see if there's anything here. Okay, there's a couple of questions that have already been popped in. What about binary bisexuals? How do they fit into the category? I'm assuming that you're referring to the category of the sex faculties, male and female, masculine and feminine. This is actually discussed in one of the Abhidhamma texts with regard to the Pandakas. Pandakas is a term that's found in the Vinaya for beings of some kind of indeterminate sexual characterization, that they're not really purely male or female. There's somewhere in between. But the Abhidhamma approaches that is that someone who's in that category, they're still either male or female, but the sex faculty is weak. But they're still going to be either on one side of the line or the other. That it only recognizes these two categories of masculine and feminine. Another question: does suicide only happen in the human realm? Um, yeah, it's kind of, I don't know what to say there. I don't know of any incidents of it happening in the higher realms. I would think it's possible in the animal realm. Um, it's not possible in the hell realm. Beings try and do it all the time, and they can't. Their body regenerates instantly. It's not possible to escape the hell realm by death, and only by the extinction of your karma. Next question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that hearing that Deva's body composition is strong in the fire element, but weak in the earth element. Yes, uh, the fire element in Deva's bodies is more intense, and one uh, result of this is that in the lower Dewa realms, particularly like the Chatu Maharajaka, they're subject to premature death in two ways, both of which are caused by an exacerbation of the fire element. One is that they call it uh, death by forgetfulness or something like that. Is when the Dewa is so engrossed in sense pleasures that they forget it's mealtime and they forget to eat. And if they miss a single meal, their bodies are so subtle because of the excess of fire element that they're vibrating at such a high plane that if they don't get nutriment at the right time, they can't sustain their body. They can't even miss a single meal, and they just die. That's the end of them. The other type of death is by anger or envy, and it's said that sometimes a Dewa will see another Dewa who's got a bigger chariot or more dancing girls or whatever, and he gets really jealous and he gets burning up with rage, and that destroys his body. I'm not seeing any more questions. Oh, here we go. Here's something. Tibetan leaders, when they die, the community looks for a child who is the leader reborn. Wouldn't that spiritual leader be in a Dewa realm? No, not in Tibetan. Uh, Not in Tibetan idea, because the leader could go to the Dewa realm, but out of compassion, he's chosen to be reborn human and help his followers. So who is the child they find? The child is the reborn Rinpoche, who is chosen to be reincarnated in a human form so he can continue teaching. Um, so one does have the choice to be reborn in a lower realm. Well, remember, we're talking about the Tibetan view here. That's not the case in the Theravada view. You don't really have a direct choice. In Theravada's understanding, rebirth is like a natural process. You don't have a direct control. you can somewhat influence your rebirth. There is this concept of rebirth by aspiration, that if someone says, I really want to be reborn into a seat of heaven, and they make that an aspiration, and they do meditation practices, and they make merit and build up the baramis appropriate to become reborn in that realm, their aspiration will tend, it's not a guarantee, but will tend to indicate or direct them to that realm. That's why I always caution people. I hear people occasionally say, "Oh, I really would be good to be like an eagle or something." I say, "No, don't wish for that. Don't wish for an animal rebirth. You might get what you want." I would argue that Mahayana's stance on materialism is a bit more nuanced than this idealism. Maybe Yogacara mind school is a bit different. You are correct. The uh, say the Tibetan uh, Abhidhamma and the Tibetan philosophy is layered, and they see the Madhyamaka philosophy as higher than Yogacara. And the Yogacara was historical. It doesn't exist anymore as an independent school. It was a historical Indian school that taught this pure idealism. But it's not a school that exists now. Uh, same question is going on, but in my understanding, it's not that there is no matter, but since self and non are both dependently originated, they can be deconstructed until one is left with sunyata. Yeah, that's the Majjhimaka view, which is um, a later than Yogacara, and it's considered by the Tibetan Vajrayanas as being the higher view. Okay, another question. So if reality is reality, even though Tibetans have this belief it won't happen, so who is the child that chooses leaders' articles? I don't know. I mean, it it seems that somehow the Tibetans work that trick. I mean, I've heard stories about these. Some of these Rinpoches, the stories about them are amazing. Like um, the Karmapa, when he was the old Karmapa died, and the new one was just a little kid, and he could. It's not like he knew all the ceremonies immediately, but he learned. There was a little kid of like 6, 7 years old, learned all these complicated ceremonies and sort of one instruction, and he had it all down. I don't know how the Tibetans work their trick there, but there seems to be some reality to it. What is the effect on rebirth of attaining prowess in the jhanas? Then prowess in the jhanas creates a very strong tendency to be reborn in the Brahma world, because that's the equivalent mode of consciousness to jhana. Okay, so
It's 7
we've
o'clock.
been going for an hour, and I think questions are kind of running down. Let's see. We've got another one here. I'll keep going. If a stream enter were to feed animals and the animals felt positive emotion towards them, would the animals generate more potent glucama due to the attainment of one feeding them? Um, I don't think so. I don't think it. I've never seen that working that way. It works the other way around. That if you feed, uh, there's one Texas. Sometime I won't remember it exactly, but if you feed an animal, the merit of that comes back to you like 10 times, and if you feed a righteous human being, then it comes back 100 times. And if you feed um, an Orion, like a stream enter or higher, it comes back, a thousand times. And if you feed a Buddha, it comes back infinitely. Is that a given or dependent also on kamas, or are you referring to the rebirth in the jhana realms? It's considered to be a very strong. It's a garu dhamma, but you have to have at the time of death, you still have to have the prowess in jhana. You still have the mastery of jhana. It's possible with jhana. It's possible to develop it and then lose it, and then that weakens the tendency to be reborn into those higher realms. But if you die while still being a master of jhana, then there's a very strong certainty of rebirth in the Brahma world. Okay, I think I'll take my leave from you, good people, and see you again next week.